on the issue of Keir Starmer, which is as unfortunately a good a place to start as any, um, I'm more convinced than ever now that he is not going to be re-elected Prime Minister in 5 years' time. I think he's already done so much damage to the Labour Party, and this is obviously supported by polling evidence that for him to get re-elected in 5 years' time, even allowing it's a long way away, and many things can and no doubt will happen in the intervening years, seems very improbable. It's possible that Labour could still win, but I think a prerequisite for that would probably be changing its own leadership, which is not something that the Labour Party has any record of doing in its history. I mean, unseating a sitting prime minister. There were always plots against Gordon Brown and Harold Wilson further back in history, but none of them ever actually came to anything. And given that a plot would have to start within the Parliamentary Labour Party, which has been manipulated, neutered, and browbeaten, and of course is composed largely of people handpicked by Keir Starmer, it is unlikely that that will happen. I think one can secondly say that this is probably the worst start any newly elected government has had in my lifetime, if not ever since governments have been elected. I mean, of course, Liz Truss was probably more cataclysmic, but then she wasn't elected by the people in a general election. She was just a sort of internal Tory coup. Keir Starmer got elected with a large parliamentary majority on the basis of a rather weak vote, well, a very weak vote, not even 34% of the electorate on a 60% turnout, so only about 20% of potential voters actually choosing Labour. But he got elected with a large parliamentary majority, but has been falling apart since, in a way, as I say, contrasts very sharply, say, with Tony Blair in 1997, who remained, better or worse, very popular for several years. Didn't really start losing popularity until the Iraq War, and had a much bigger vote to begin with. So there's been several, I think, reasons for this collapse. There's both sort of superficial reasons and more underlying ones. The superficial ones, well, we should start with the decision made within the first few weeks to cut winter fuel benefit for 9 or 10 million pensioners. This is in a slightly different category to the decision to maintain the two-child benefit cap, which led to a rebellion that had 7 Labour MPs deprived of the whip. Not because it's better or worse, but Labour had said before the election it was not going to lift the two-child benefit cap, at least not immediately, that it was going to remain. Whereas the winter fuel payment was entirely untrailed. It wasn't in the manifesto, wasn't even suggested in any speeches. It is one of those benefits that the Treasury has wanted to cut for a long time, because they regard it as they regard almost all benefits as wasteful. They have a new Chancellor of the Exchequer coming in. Her CV is now a matter of controversy, so how much experience she actually has is unknown. But they then say to her, well, there's bad news, Chancellor. We've found an enormous black hole in the public finances. But the good news is here's a way to start filling it. And she falls into the trap because it's been a political disaster, quite out of proportion to the money that the government will actually save. And it's one of 3 things that I think have cut through to the public attention negatively since Starmer was elected. The second is, I don't know what you call it, Frockgate, Freebiegate, the fact that Starmer, his wife, and several senior members of the shadow cabinet have been clothed at the expense of Lord Ali, the Labour Party donor, as well as being given free tickets to this and that. But I think it is the clothing more than the free tickets that really resonates with the public, who obviously all have to buy their own suits and dresses. And it sent a message of entitlement and indulgence, self-indulgence, at a time when you're cutting benefits for millions of pensioners, for some of whom certainly it will be a hardship. I think that cut through. And I think, thirdly, the inheritance tax on farmers is cut through too, where there are two sides to that argument. Definitely, it's a problem that you have. It's an industry, if you can call it that, where the asset base doesn't relate very clearly in all cases to the income level. So you can get taxed on a £3 million farm when you inherit it, which is only making, say, 50 or 60,000 pounds profit a year. Anyway, whatever the ins and outs of the issue are, and certainly there's the problems of billionaire landowners and so on. Farmers demonstrating do resonate publicly, so I don't think it's a terribly popular move. But all this comes back to the fact that the government is needing to raise money without really tackling raising corporation tax, high rate of income tax, or wealth tax, having boxed themselves in on tax by having pledged not to raise revenues that account to about 75 or 80% of the government's total income. You're not left with very many options. I think Labour's problems have been compounded by this squabbling in Downing Street. I don't think that's an issue that cut through with the public, most of whom have no idea who Sue Gray or Morgan McSweeney are. But this it has certainly been a string of setbacks, which means that a lot of, Labour has a large majority, but many of those MPs, 150, 200, are now looking at what are very thin majorities and thinking that this shift in Parliament they're doing is more by way of a career break than a new launch for themselves. So the anxiety is rising very high. But I think one has to look underneath these particular controversies to see how weak the Starmer position is. Since he was elected leader, he famously walked away from all the pledges he'd made in policy terms to the party to get elected. And it's really been defined solely by hostility to the left and a determination to extirpate all traces of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in terms of policy, personnel, and even Jeremy Corbyn himself. To the extent that I think Starmer and his team spent very little time really planning what they were going to do in government. They simply wanted to get elected by destroying the left. And of course, in a sense, this worked. They are elected. But the failure after 14 years of a really miserable Tory government to secure any broad base of electoral support is really striking. To end up with those figures that I mentioned, which are, you'll all know this, but it bears repeating almost endlessly, 500,000 fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn got at his worst as Labour leader in 2019, 3 million less than he got at his best in 2017, and 6% smaller share of what was a larger poll in 2017 as well. So it's fair to say that Labour under Starmer, despite a government been up against a government of shocking cruelty and incompetence and squabbling between 2019 and 24, failed to convince anyone that they were really what the country wanted. What it did was instead appease the establishment by saying, we are a safe pair of hands. So appease the media, appease all those elements, who conspired to defeat Jeremy Corbyn and say we can be trusted. But the more you go into the detail of their electoral performance, I've gone into it to a certain extent. I think Leah, who's on the call, has gone into it in even more detail, was how there's almost no area other than Scotland where the SNP vote sort of declined substantially, where Labour has convinced people that it is a better alternative now than it was under Jeremy Corbyn. Not in the red wall seats, not in seats like yours, where Keir Starmer lost half his personal vote. They get a quite extraordinary statistic no one in the media wants to talk about. So all their activities haven't really managed to make Labour electoral, except electorally successful under circumstances where the right was completely split. Now, it's probably wrong to say that you can simply add the Reform vote to the Tory vote and make that a unified bloc. There's elements in the Reform vote in working class communities in the north and so on that would never vote for the Tories under any circumstances. Likewise, if you were to try and win over all the Reform voters, the Tories would no doubt lose some votes in the other direction to the Liberals. But nevertheless, you could probably assume that 2/3 of the Reform vote could be won to the Tories. Had that been the case in 2024, in July, the election would have been neck and neck. Now we're looking at a situation in the opinion polls where the Tory and Reform vote aggregated is nearly half the electorate. It's about 48, 49%. Of course, coalescing that vote behind one party or the other, or unifying the two parties, is going to be very challenging. But my bet is that Reform is going to start making serious breakthroughs, like in the next Welsh election for the Welsh Assembly. They look like they could get 13, 14 seats, and they could start winning constituencies, the old mining seats. I saw in the Rhondda, absolute heartland of Labour for 130 years. Its vote fell below half the poll for the first time. Still won the seat, but below half the poll. And this is what's happening in other countries. In France, there are former areas that used to vote communist, now represented by the Front National. Same thing in Germany. And one can see the disintegration of Labour's electoral coalition setting in. That's not just measured by its poor polling in broad figures, but by the number of different challenges it faces with Reform voters, national populism, which is advancing in almost all countries. The Greens, who could easily take every seat in Bristol next time, as well as possibly Brighton and so on, who are getting an element of the sort of radical middle class vote or urban vote, metropolitan vote that was drawn to Labour under Corbyn. The independent MPs, who are a serious challenge, I think, in probably 25, 30 seats at the next election, mainly seats with a high Muslim population, who, even if Gaza is less of a salient issue in 5 years' time than it was now, and there's no guarantee of that at all, I think there's been a rupture there that won't be easily repaired, and certainly won't be when more than 100 Labour MPs, including most of the cabinet and Keir Starmer himself, turned up to praise Israel at a Labour Friends of Israel dinner 2 days ago. In Scotland, there's the SNP. So Labour is now fighting on many contradictory fronts, by which I mean if you step in one direction to try and secure votes, you risk losing them even more in another, where the electoral base, Labour's historical electoral base, has really been declining for about 30 years at least, and it began under New Labour and has accelerated. Jeremy Corbyn assembled an electoral base in 2017, which got Labour above 40% of the vote for only the third time since 1970. But all of this now seems to be disintegrating under a party that offered no real political change, did offer calm and competent management, and has failed really on that so far. It's clear, I think, to a lot of Labour MPs that the leader isn't really very good at politics. No doubt he was a reliable manager of the Crown Prosecution Service, and you probably think he could run a medium-sized business without calamity ensuing. But he certainly has none of the political skills that Blair had in abundance initially. He has no capacity to empathise, no capacity to communicate. And so you cannot see this halt being easily dug out of. So the bottom layer of the problem is, of course, his unwillingness to confront the scale of changes that the crisis in Britain and the British state requires. Refusal to really confront any vested interest, any centre of power. And of course, that was true of Blair as well, but that was in a time when the economy was growing and when the world was relatively peaceful. Now we are 15, 16 years into a slump. People's patience is exhausted. We're in a world of wars, and it's not a world in which defending the status quo is going to pay any political or electoral dividends. The danger we have, and this perhaps will unite what I've talked about with the title that Susan introduced us with at the beginning, is that right now the beneficiaries of this are going to be the Tory party and Reform. No one else is really placed to benefit on all the polling evidence, possibly the SNP in Scotland. But actually, this is a very dangerous situation. If the choice we are left with, or the political poles of attraction, whatever party name you have on them, are a sort of decaying liberal centrism or nationalist populism of the right. There needs to be urgently the development of a left pole, a socialist pole of attraction. I have no doubt that such a thing is possible. We saw possibly 400,000 people join the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. Most of them have now left, but they're all mostly still around. We saw the breakthrough in 5 seats, which elected left-wing independents in July. In at least 4 of them, that was completely against anyone's expectation or beyond anyone's expectation. As I said, that number could easily have been doubled in July. I mean, there's another half a dozen who are very close. And that number could grow. The problem is translating this potential into action, and I'm sure that's something this group has considered many times, and it's certainly been chewed over a lot since Starmer became leader, or since his agenda became clear. But I think such an initiative has to start with on the basis of the things we've gained, which is the 5 MPs that are elected, the possibility of them being joined by some of the 7 who have been suspended, who are all obviously on the left. Their suspension comes up again for renewal or ending or making permanent in January, and I think they'll be in different places, the 7, after that. So the 5 MPs may become 7, 8. That's possible. Then you have the next sort of circle is those candidates that polled really well, made an impact in the general election, including, of course, Andrew Feinstein, Liane Mohammed, Faiza Shaheen, others. And then there's a larger number of councillors who've left Labour, mainly over Gaza, although in some cases, quite a few cases, it was a last straw. So I think any project that bypasses all of these, it seems to me, is futile. I think they have to, in some shape or form, coalesce as the centre of any project. Now, of course, it's not ideal. If you look at the five MPs at the moment, that they're all men. Four of them are Muslim, which is absolutely fine in any individual, but it doesn't create a group that necessarily looks like what one's wanting to project in toto. But nevertheless, we have to start where we are. And these are the people that will have to, I think, spearhead any initiative, whatever shape it takes. It's likely to be, I think, a fairly loose form of electoral alliance initially, rather than a new party, which there isn't I think, the widespread enough sympathy for at this stage. But whether it's through that route or through another, or something that may surprise us, the need for there to be this, if you like, third pole that draws on the strengths of Corbynism, on the Gaza movement, and longer ago, the anti-austerity movement and the movement against the Iraq War, which are probably the most substantive interventions that the left has made in British politics this century. Those four, we do need to proceed to that, because I think we should be in no doubt, as things stand now, Starmer is failing. Not a surprise, but the extent of his failure is, I think, shocking. At the moment, either Kemi Badenoch or Nigel Farage, separately or in some combination, are going to be the beneficiaries. That is a grim outlook, and we have to somehow get on the field with a third alternative.